Dear readers, we're back with a novel that has captured widespread attention, The Midnight Library. This thought-provoking work of fiction explores the endless possibilities of what if, delving into sensitive themes with a beautifully uplifting approach that encourages looking ahead in life. Let's dive into a quick summary and uncover more about this intriguing read. The prologue introduces a young Nora Seed playing chess with her school librarian, Mrs. Elm. As they play, Nora worries about her future, but Mrs. Elm reassures her, saying, "You could be anything you want to be, Nora. Think of all that possibility. It's exciting." Nora's concerns revolve around her brother, who has left town, and her father's frustration over her quitting competitive swimming despite her potential. Mrs. Elm suggests glaciology as a career that could take Nora away from her dreary hometown, but before they can continue, she rushes to answer a phone call. From her reaction, Nora realizes something has happened. Someone is looking for her, and whatever news Mrs. Elm has received leaves her gasping in shock. The first chapter shifts to 19 years later, just 27 hours before Nora decides to unalive herself. Early in the day, she receives an unexpected visit from Ash, a doctor who once asked her out for coffee. Hoping he might do so again, she warms to the idea, but their interaction remains awkward. He then delivers devastating news. Her cat Voltaire has been hit by a car. Nora rushes outside to find Voltaire lifeless, and while heartbroken, she envies the cat's fate. Later, she arrives late to work at a music store, String Theory, still mourning. Hoping for sympathy, she tells her boss, Neil, about Voltaire's death, but instead, he questions her past choices, why she quit swimming at 14 despite her talent, why she earned a philosophy degree only to return to Bedford, and why she left the Labyrinths, the band she formed with her brother Joe and their friend Ravi when they had a chance to succeed. She had even left her engagement to Dan just 2 days before the wedding. When Neil mentions Joe was recently in town but didn't visit her, it stings. In the end, Neil fires her, claiming she should do something better with her life. Jobless and aimless, Nora wanders through Bedford, reflecting on her life. Dan, her ex-fiancé, still sends her drunken texts professing his love. As it starts to rain, she takes shelter in a magazine store, wondering if things could get any worse. There, she unexpectedly runs into Ravi, her brother Joe's best friend and her former bandmate. Hoping for answers, she asks about Joe's visit, but Ravi remains distant. Still resentful, he reminds her how she abandoned the Labyrinths just as they had a shot at success. Now Joe struggles with depression and can't keep a stable home, while Ravi scrapes by, cleaning toilets and playing mediocre gigs in pubs. As their conversation turns into a tense argument, Nora defends herself, saying she left the band to marry Dan, but Ravi doesn't buy it. "I don't think your problem was stage fright or wedding fright. I think your problem was life fright," he tells her. His words hit hard, and as Ravi storms out, Nora is left to grapple with yet another painful truth. Desperate for connection, Nora texts her friend Izzy. It's now 7 hours before she will decide to unalive herself. She reflects on her favorite philosopher, Henry David Thoreau, and his words about confidently pursuing one's dreams, but she doubts their relevance. Life in Bedford feels far more complicated. Nothing ever seems to happen in her life. When her phone rings, she hopes it's Izzy or her brother, but instead, it's Doreen, the mother of her piano student Leo. Nora has completely forgotten his lesson, and both Leo and Doreen waited before giving up. Worse, Doreen cancels his lessons altogether, saying he's lost interest. An hour later, Mr. Banerjee, an elderly man she helps with prescriptions, informs her that he no longer needs her assistance. Overwhelmed by a crushing sense of uselessness, Nora rushes home. Her apartment still smells like Voltaire, making her grief even heavier. She pours herself a glass of wine and scrolls through social media, where everyone else's lives seem fulfilling. Taking stock of her failures, she feels certain she wasn't meant to live. Even her antidepressants offer no relief. Drowning in despair, Nora finishes her wine, posts a final update, and writes her last note. Nora attempts to unalive herself, but when she opens her eyes, she finds herself on a mist-covered pathway. As the fog clears, she sees a vast building with a clock frozen at midnight. Stepping inside, she is met with endless bookshelves filled with books of varying sizes, all in different shades of green. Searching for an exit, she finds none. When she pulls a book from a shelf, a voice warns her to be careful. Turning around, she sees a prim and proper librarian, Mrs. Elm, her old high school librarian. The sight triggers a memory from 19 years ago. the day Mrs. Elm received an ominous phone call in the school library. That day, Mrs. Elm had broken the devastating news of Nora's father's sudden death from a heart attack and had comforted her as she cried. Now standing in this strange, infinite library, Nora wonders where she is. Looking at Mrs. Elm, she hesitantly asks the question lingering in her mind, "Am I dead?" Mrs. Elm explains Nora's whereabouts with a simple statement. Between life and death, there is a library. This library holds all the lives Nora could have lived had she made different choices. Each book offers her the chance to step into an alternate version of her life. She calls this place the Midnight Library. Though Nora believes she is dead, Mrs. Elm reminds her that they exist in the space between life and death. When Nora insists that she wants to die, Mrs. Elm gently tells her that death isn't a choice. It chooses whom it takes, not the other way around. Saddened by this, Nora feels as though even death is rejecting her. Overwhelmed with regret, she begins to dwell on all the choices she wishes she had made differently. As the bookshelves begin shifting, speeding up, slowing down, Nora asks what's happening. Mrs. Elm explains that each book represents a life where Nora made one different choice, triggering a ripple effect of changes like parallel universes. To illustrate, she asks Nora what she would have done differently if given the chance. Since Nora struggles to choose, Mrs. Elm presents her with a gray book, the Book of Regrets. When Nora opens it, she sees her regrets stretching back to her earliest years. Some are faint, others bold. Some fade in and out as if they are not entirely fixed. The weight of all the possibilities she never lived begins to settle in. Nora recalls how she met Dan and the happiness he brought her. They had planned to open a countryside pub, but her mother's illness put everything on hold. After her mother's death, Nora abandoned their dream, called off the wedding, cancelled plans to move to Australia with Izzy, and sabotaged her own future. Overwhelmed by regret, she drops the book and breaks down. Mrs. Elm urges her to shut it before the regret consumes her. Though heavy, Nora manages to close it. Mrs. Elm urges Nora to choose a life based on a regret she wishes to undo. She explains that the Midnight Library exists as long as Nora's root life continues, offering only future possibilities, no past lives. If Nora allows depression to consume her, it will affect her root life, and if she feels disappointment in a new life, she will return to the library to choose again. To escape this limbo, she must find a life where she is truly happy. Finally, Nora decides to explore the life she would have had with Dan and their dream of opening a pub. Mrs. Elm hands her the book, and as Nora reads the first line, the text vanishes. She is transported into her new life. Nora finds herself in the English countryside wearing a wedding ring and realizing she and Dan own the Three Horseshoes, their dream pub. As she explores, she pretends to know the locals. When Dan arrives, nostalgia washes over her, but she soon notices his crude humor, heavy drinking, and disdain for her past music career, traits she once ignored. Outside, she receives texts from Izzy, realizing their friendship is stronger in this life. Back inside, Dan's distant demeanor unsettles her. In their bedroom, she learns he had an affair with a woman named Erin. Their conversation turns tense and Dan dismisses her concerns. Realizing this life isn't what she thought, Nora retreats to the bathroom and fades away. Nora returns to a different part of the Midnight Library and admits to Mrs. Elm that her ideal life with Dan wasn't what she had imagined. Mrs. Elm responds that it's difficult to predict what will truly make us happy. When Nora expresses concern about the version of herself she left behind, Mrs. Elm reassures her that those versions won't recall anything unusual. At most, they'll experience a fleeting sense of having entered a room and forgotten why, just as people often do. Despite trying on a new life, Nora confesses that she still wants to die. Mrs. Elm explains the difference between want and lack. Sometimes what we perceive as a desire is actually a response to something missing. She suggests that if Nora can identify what she truly lacks, she might no longer feel the urge to unalive herself. Nora remains unconvinced, believing that life is meaningless if she exists in multiple versions of it. However, her perspective begins to shift when Mrs. Elm encourages her to revisit the Book of Regrets to pinpoint something she genuinely wants to experience. Casually, Mrs. Elm brings up Voltaire, Nora's cat. Though Nora suspects Mrs. Elm is playing a strategic game with her, much like the chess game she's currently engaged in, she takes the bait. She asks to visit a life where she was a good cat owner to Voltaire and one in which she no longer wants to be unalived. Nora wakes up in Bedford and searches for Voltaire, only to find him lifeless under the bed. Calling him by his nickname, Voltsy, she reaches for him but is immediately pulled back into the Midnight Library in shock. Mrs. Elm, now reading in a comfortable chair, reminds Nora that she didn't ask for a life where Voltaire was alive, only one where she was a good cat owner and he was inside the house. Voltaire, it turns out, had a heart disease that led to his death in every life. In her root life, he hadn't been hit by a car, but had gone outside knowing he was about to die, as many animals do. Mrs. Elm assures Nora that she had been a great cat owner and that Voltaire had lived one of his best lives with her. She instructs Nora to check the Book of Regrets, where her regret about Voltaire disappears, changing how she sees herself. When Nora questions why she must experience painful truths, Mrs. Elm tells her that sometimes the only way to learn is to live. Now seeing things differently, Nora chooses to explore the life where she moved to Australia with Izzy. Mrs. Elm notes that Nora is getting better at picking meaningful lives but doesn't elaborate. Handing her the book, she watches as Nora reads the first sentence and vanishes into that life. Nora gasps for air in a saltwater pool by the beach, realizing this must be part of her daily routine. Warmly greeted by fellow swimmers, she notes her colorful Casio watch, hoping it reflects her personality in this life. Searching for Izzy, she soon realizes she's living in a different town than expected, making her wonder if they've had a falling out. Determined to learn more, she checks her phone and finds her apartment address in an email. Upon arriving, she meets her roommate Jojo, who is not Izzy. When she asks about Izzy, Jojo grows uncomfortable and reveals that Izzy died in a car crash while driving to visit Nora for her birthday. The shock pulls Nora back into the midnight library where she finds Mrs. Elm playing chess. When Nora laments the life she just left, Mrs. Elm reminds her that good choices don't always lead to good outcomes. In that life, Nora became depressed after Izzy's death and remained stuck in Sydney, unable to move forward. Mrs. Elm urges Nora to choose another life. Though still doubtful, Nora recalls the joy of swimming in Australia and how she once loved competitive swimming in her root life. Nicknamed the Fish, she quit due to pressure, a decision that strained her relationship with her father. Feeling regret, she asks to experience the life where she never gave up swimming. Meanwhile, Mrs. Elm continues making cryptic remarks that Nora struggles to decipher. Nora wakes up in London in the best shape of her life and quickly realizes she is immensely successful. She's set to give a speech titled Inspiring Success and feels strong while exercising, unlike in her root life. Curious, she looks up Izzy, Dan, and herself online. Izzy is alive and happy in Australia, while Dan, now married to a spin class instructor, is also doing well. Nora's Wikipedia page reveals she won Olympic gold and silver, set world records, and retired from competition at 28. She now works for the BBC and has authored memoirs on success. While searching for a pool, Nora receives a call from a woman named Nadia, who stuns her by handing the phone to her father, alive in this life. Though she tries to act normal, both Nadia and her father sense something is off. She soon learns that her father had an affair with Nadia, divorced her mother, and is now happy in his new life. He also mentions that something traumatic happened to her in Portugal and that she sees a therapist. Struggling to process this, Nora assures him she's fine and ends the call. Later, while swimming, Nora reflects on this life. Her father, once emotionally distant, seems happy, yet her mother died alone. She herself is successful but isolated. A wave of resentment builds. This life may be a dream on paper, but at what cost? Following the itinerary left for her, Nora heads to the lobby to prepare for her talk. There she is surprised to see her brother Joe, happy, well-dressed, and seemingly successful. Overwhelmed, she marvels at their close relationship in this life. However, like her father and Nadia, both Joe and Rory, the woman assisting with the event, notice something unusual about her behavior. As they wait for the event to begin, Joe, who has been her manager for the past 7 years, hands her a peppermint tea, though she secretly craves coffee. He checks on her, reminding her that the 40-minute talk is worth a significant amount of money. When Nora asks if he ever wonders how life could have been different, Joe dismisses the idea, saying he doesn't dwell on such thoughts. She also learns that he has been happily married to a man named Ewan for 5 years, a stark contrast to her root life where he struggled with relationships. During their conversation, Nora quotes Thoreau, surprising Joe. She realizes that in this life she sacrificed her love for philosophy to become a great swimmer. When she asks where she was when their mother died, Joe reminds her that she was too busy with her demanding schedule. Their mother, struggling with alcoholism after the affair with Nadia, had died alone. The revelation leaves Nora guilt-ridden, but Joe is shocked by her reaction, since in this life she was never close to their mother. When it's time for her talk, Nora wants to escape but is forced to go through with it. She begins speaking about the tree of life, describing how its branches represent different choices, all connected to a single root. Drawing from her experiences in the Midnight Library, she weaves in lessons from Mrs. Elm. But as she speaks, she has a realization. No matter how many choices she makes, a rotten life will always be rotten. Overcome with emotion, she abruptly tells the audience that she has life fright, leaving them in stunned silence. As Joe signals for her to stop, she feels herself slipping away from this successful life, returning once again to the Midnight Library. Upon returning to the Midnight Library, Nora immediately notices something is wrong. The lights flicker wildly, and Mrs. Elm appears panicked, both signs of a system error. Strangely, Mrs. Elm doesn't respond to Nora's voice. It isn't until Nora reaches out and touches her that Mrs. Elm suddenly becomes aware of her presence. Mrs. Elm explains that there was a glitch in Nora's transfer, which could mean that in her root life, she is edging closer to death. This revelation unsettles Nora. However, as she recalls the joy she felt while swimming, a conflict stirs within her. Perhaps she doesn't want to die after all. The moment this thought takes hold, the lights stop flickering and the system stabilizes. With this new realization, Nora expresses a desire to experience a life where her mother is still alive. But Mrs. Elm gently reminds her that the books in the Midnight Library contain only her possible lives, not the rewritten lives of others. Instead, she nudges Nora toward another path, glaciology. Intrigued, Nora decides to step into a life where she followed her passion for studying glaciers in the Arctic Circle. Nora wakes up in Svalbard, sharing a cabin with Ingrid Skurbeck, a geoscience professor. She quickly realizes she's hungover and out of shape. The brutal cold seeps through her layers, nearly burning her skin. When Ingrid asks why she became a glaciologist, Nora dodges the question, instead asking Ingrid the same. At the cafeteria, Nora observes the eerie, beautiful landscape and the scientists around her. A man who seems more suited to a beach, Hugo Lefebvre, introduces himself, praising her work on pulsating glaciers. He hints at knowing something about her situation, making Nora uneasy. Later, Nora finds herself on an icy patch, rifle in hand, serving as a polar bear spotter. Her role is to warn scientists conducting fieldwork by firing a flare and making noise to scare off bears, only shooting as a last resort. As Nora stands watch, she recalls a warm conversation with Ash, the doctor who once offered to buy her coffee. Years ago, when she took her mother to the hospital, Ash recognized her from string theory and shared his belief that social media made people lonelier. A sudden splash interrupts her thoughts. Fearing a polar bear, she's relieved to see a walrus instead. But when another much larger figure emerges, she realizes her worst fear. A polar bear is approaching. Frozen in terror, she finally fires the flare, but nothing changes. She bangs a saucepan desperately, yet the bear remains unfazed. In that moment of panic, Nora has a revelation. She doesn't want to die. This realization fuels her determination. She bangs the saucepan rhythmically, forcing herself to believe she isn't scared. As she repeats this to herself, the bear finally retreats into the water. Her co-workers arrive and they all return to the ship. Though still in shock, Nora understands it's not just from the near-death experience, but from her overwhelming desire to live. She admires her fellow scientists for their dedication to studying climate change, despite the harsh conditions and little recognition. Reflecting on her parents' struggles, she realizes that life isn't about constant perfection, but about enduring its ups and downs. With this, she forgives her parents, recognizing how deeply she loved them all along. After dinner, Hugo confronts Nora, bluntly stating that she's been acting differently. Though she tries to avoid him, he admits that he knows she knows nothing about glaciers. Then he reveals a shocking truth. He's just like her, someone who moves through different versions of their root life. Though Nora doesn't fully trust Hugo, she's intrigued and agrees to meet him in the kitchen to learn more. There, Hugo explains his experiences as a slider, someone who shifts between alternate lives. Unlike Nora's Midnight Library, his in-between station is a video store run by his deceased Uncle Philippe, where VHS tapes reveal his other lives. He suggests that their guides, Mrs. Elm and Uncle Philippe, are merely interpretations, created by their minds to comprehend the unfathomable complexity of the quantum realm. Hugo has met many other sliders and explains the pattern. Each person's guide is someone familiar who helps them navigate infinite possibilities. In his root life, Hugo is a scientist, but he only truly understood this phenomenon after meeting a quantum physicist who explained it through the lens of the quantum wave function. He references Schrödinger's cat experiment, illustrating that every possibility exists simultaneously. Even if one observes the cat alive, in another reality, it is dead. Hugo sums it up simply. Every moment of your life, you enter a new universe with every decision you make. Hugo and Nora discuss what happens when someone vanishes from a life. Hugo has witnessed it before, someone disappearing mid-conversation. He explains that if Nora vanished now, the real her would feel momentarily confused, but her brain would eventually fill in the gaps. As they talk, they flirt. Hugo reveals he has lived nearly 300 lives and prefers the in-between over his root life, as he's dying from an aneurysm there. He quotes Camus saying that one can't truly experience life while constantly searching for its meaning. Their conversation grows more intimate, and when they speculate about being romantically involved in another life, Nora kisses him. They sleep together, but Nora finds the experience hollow. Despite Hugo's passion for life, he seems emotionally detached. As she reflects on her disappointment, she suddenly disappears. Back in the Midnight Library, Nora questions Mrs. Elm about her role. Mrs. Elm confirms that she is merely a mechanism, like everything else in the library. Frustrated, Nora criticizes the system, arguing that it's unfair she can die in a life that isn't her root life. Mrs. Elm, delighted, points out that Nora's anger proves she wants to live. To emphasize this, she shows Nora that the Book of Regrets is growing lighter. She urges Nora to choose carefully, warning that she may not have as much time as someone like Hugo. For her next life, Nora decides to see what would have happened if she had played in a band with Ravi and her brother. Nora finds herself on stage, performing with the Labyrinths in front of a massive crowd. Thrilled, she sees Ravi beside her, but learns that Joe is handling press elsewhere. Overwhelmed by the experience, she suggests an old song for the encore, unaware of the band's newer music. Back at the hotel, Ravi notices her odd behavior. Nora then receives a message from Izzy with whale pictures and a Thoreau quote about being wild and free. She discovers she has over 11 million Instagram followers, with one of her posts featuring a poem titled Fire about wielding power. Their manager, Joanna, updates them on their success. When Ravi asks about a podcast interview, Joanna reveals that it has been rescheduled for that night and that the interviewers only want to speak with Nora, creating tension between her and Ravi. Nora's phone rings again. It's a video chat with Ryan Bailey, the famous American actor she has a crush on in her root life. When he calls her babe, she struggles to remain calm, realizing they had once dated in this life. Shocked, she learns she was the one who ended things. Ryan mentions he's seeing a therapist, and before ending the call, Nora brings up his supposed interest in philosophy, only for him to admit it was all for show. As Nora signs autographs and poses for pictures, she reflects on the vastly different lives she has lived. Joanna introduces her to the interviewer, and the podcast begins. She discovers that her ex Dan had harassed and stalked her in this life. As she speaks about happiness not being constant in any life, she suddenly learns a devastating truth. Her brother Joe had died from drug and alcohol abuse. Their song Howl was written about his death. Overwhelmed, she rushes to confront Ravi, realizing he had misunderstood when she asked about Joe earlier. He thought she meant Joe, their manager. Crushed by this revelation, Nora disappears from this life. When Nora returns to the Midnight Library, she insists that the process stop. Mrs. Elm reminds her that she alone controls the library. As Nora refuses to visit more books, the library begins to shake. Books fly off the shelves, and the lights go out. Mrs. Elm urges her to remember how she felt when facing the polar bear, truly alive. This realization stabilizes the library, and the lights return. Mrs. Elm advises Nora to stop seeking others' approval. Nora realizes that every life she has lived so far, Joe's band, Dan's pub, her father's swimming dream, or even Mrs. Elm's suggestion of glaciology, was based on someone else's expectations. Determined to explore on her own terms, she chooses a life where she works at an animal shelter instead of string theory. This life feels peaceful, even gentle. She cares for dogs and cats and has a sweet boyfriend, Dylan, who is as loyal as a dog himself. However, she notices that string theory has shut down, making her wonder if it was because she wasn't there to help. She also encounters Ash, who doesn't recognize her in this life. As she spends time with Dylan, she feels like an imposter. This life belongs to the Nora who truly fell for him. Before fading away, she notices a wine bottle label about tending vineyards. In the next life, she is in the US, running a winery with her husband, Eduardo Martinez. This life is easy to fake. She just recites wine facts to tourists. Eduardo is kind but indifferent, and Nora realizes she isn't truly needed here. She understands that she can try endless lives, but to stay in one, she must believe no better life exists. She experiences countless lives, teaching music in Montreal, cat-sitting, aid work in Botswana. being a concert pianist, a vegan powerlifter, and even one where she only eats toast. She briefly reunites with Hugo in one life, but he fades away mid-conversation. Unlike him, Nora longs for a place to put down roots. However, the constant shifting between lives begins to erode her sense of identity. When Nora returns to the library, it is engulfed in darkness. She tells Mrs. Elm that she no longer feels anything while experiencing different versions of her life. Mrs. Elm explains that Nora is lost because she is still living for others. To find her way, she must remember what she truly cherished in her root life. Nora recalls the importance of kindness, especially from Mrs. Elm and Ash. As this realization dawns on her, the library lights return. Determined to explore a life driven by her own choices, she asks to experience the life where she said yes when Ash invited her for coffee. Nora wakes up in another life, immediately noticing her exhaustion. Beside her, she hopes to find Ash, and is relieved when he stirs, confirming it is indeed him. As she tiptoes out to explore, she encounters a frightened little girl, her daughter. The child, afraid of bears, seeks comfort, but Nora hesitates, feeling guilty. This isn't truly her life, and forming emotional bonds could complicate things. Still, she accompanies the girl to her room so Ash remains undisturbed. When the child asks what happens after death, Nora reassures her, saying people can live different lives, but that she doesn't need to worry. Nora nearly tears up when the girl mentions camping, sensing the warmth of this life. To soothe her, Nora suggests a game, one that not only calms the child, but also helps Nora gather details. She learns the girl's name is Molly, they live in Cambridge, Ash is a doctor, and she herself is a philosophy professor on sabbatical. Even better, she and her brother Joe are close in this reality. Eventually, Nora falls asleep beside Molly. The next morning, Ash brings her coffee and they discuss their day. He has multiple surgeries while she will drop Molly at school before returning home to work. After dropping Molly off, Nora admires their home, noting its elegance and comfort. Checking emails, she discovers she is writing a book on Thoreau and modern environmentalism. Their shelves are filled with literature on feminism, science, and philosophy. As she takes it all in, this life feels close to perfect. Nora finds happiness with Ash and Molly, enjoying simple routines like playing at the park and cooking dinner together. Occasionally, she slips up, such as being rude to a neighbor she doesn't recognize, causing Ash to grow concerned about her forgetfulness. Despite these moments, life flows smoothly. Yet this ease unsettles Nora. If she truly belonged here, she should be forgetting the Midnight Library, but she still remembers it and her root life. One night she brings up parallel universes to Ash. While he finds the idea intriguing, he tells her she makes him feel grounded. Later, the family visits Joe and his husband Ewan in Hammersmith. They share a wonderful evening over dinner, during which Nora notices a bottle from the Buena Vista vineyard, making her wonder if Eduardo is as happy without her. She also learns that Joe is abstaining from alcohol. Curious, she asks if she was difficult when they were younger. Joe downplays their fallout over the band, but Nora apologizes anyway. In return, Joe admits he was also at fault for mistreating her. He once dismissed her struggles, but after witnessing Ewan's mental health challenges, he now understands their weight. Nora's forgetfulness continues to trouble Ash. At one point, she even forgets he has asthma. Yet she also starts recalling details from this life that she hadn't known before, like people's names and her role as a professor. One day, when Molly falls off her tricycle, Nora comforts her and feels something she had tried to resist: love. She realizes her root life was shaped by a lack of love. She had loved no one, and no one had loved her back. This realization fills her with both longing and fear. She doesn't want to lose this life, but also feels like an imposter, inhabiting a world she didn't create. Overwhelmed, she seeks out Mrs. Elm, visiting Oak Leaf Residential Care Home in hopes of playing chess with her. There she encounters Mr. Banerjee, her former neighbor, who doesn't recognize her. In this life, he lost his home and now lives in the care facility, feeling lonely. Saddened, Nora asks about Mrs. Elm, only to learn that she passed away peacefully 3 weeks ago. Heartbroken, she leaves. As Nora walks toward town, she passes Mr. Banerjee's old home, wondering what choices led to his different fate. She recalls Mrs. Elm's words about small actions having a big impact. In town, she sees the police arresting Leo, her former music pupil in her root life and a friend. She tries to intervene, insisting Leo is a good kid, but the officers dismiss her, revealing he had a weapon and a record. Even Leo looks confused when she mentions his love for music. Nora suddenly realizes that in this life she never worked at string theory, meaning she never encouraged Leo's musical interests. Without her influence, his path took a different turn. As the familiar tingling sensation signals her fading from this life, she desperately tries to convince herself that this is where she belongs. Passing by string theory, Nora notices the same note in the window as in another life. Without her, the shop struggled, unable to stay afloat. As she leaves town, she sees Bedford differently, once a prison in her eyes, now a place shaped by her own perception. She also regrets not visiting Mrs. Elm before she passed. Despite trying to convince herself she belongs, Nora senses she will soon fade. Rushing home, she finds Ash and Molly outside. She cryptically says goodbye to Molly, knowing she won't be there much longer. When Molly asks to water the flowers, Ash gently says the sky has already taken care of them. Nora takes solace in knowing another version of herself will care for Ash and Molly. As Ash talks about their evening plans, she fades away, heartbroken over the love she found for her daughter. When Nora returns to the Midnight Library, Mrs. Elm is frantically working at the computer. Desperate, Nora begs to return to the life with Ash and Molly, but Mrs. Elm reminds her that she can't relive a past life. As she speaks, the computer breaks down, the ceiling cracks, and flames engulf the library. Taking shelter under a table, Mrs. Elm explains that something is wrong in Nora's root life. She's dying. The chaos around them mirrors her struggle between life and death. When Mrs. Elm urges her to check her watch, Nora realizes time is moving again, signaling her desire to live. Nora finally understands. The life with Ash and Molly showed her that even small actions can make a difference. She no longer wants to die. She wants to live. The library is collapsing because she no longer needs it. To survive, she must find a specific book and escape before it vanishes forever. Nora rushes toward the spot where Mrs. Elm said she would find the book, but before she can reach it, a massive chunk of the ceiling crashes down, pinning her beneath the debris. Trapped, she is overwhelmed by the crushing thought that she will die here, lost in the Midnight Library. But as she lies there, something shifts. The more she thinks about her root life, the more she sees its value. Her brother Izzy, Leo, all the people she cares about are still there, and she had made a difference, however small. Her life had potential. It was never as hopeless as she once believed. Mrs. Elm's voice cuts through the chaos, urging her not to give up. Summoning every ounce of strength, Nora fights her way free from the wreckage. To her surprise, she sees the book she needs, the book of her root life, untouched by the flames. With the pen Mrs. Elm gave her, she opens the book and finds it completely blank. As the library crumbles around her and time pushes forward, Nora finally writes the words that will change everything. I am alive. And with that, the Midnight Library disappears. Nora wakes up after midnight in her root life, her body rejecting the overdose as she staggers out of bed and vomits. Weak and disoriented, she forces herself outside and makes her way to Mr. Banerjee's house. Desperate, she confesses that she's done something terrible and pleads with him to call the police. Then everything goes black. When she wakes, she's in a hospital bed. Her body aches, but she's alive. A nurse gently asks her about her attempt, and for the first time, Nora speaks the truth. She doesn't want to die anymore. Looking out the window, she takes in the quiet beauty of Bedford. Her home, flawed yet full of possibility. Later, she picks up her phone and erases her final posts on social media, replacing them with a message about hope, about change, about the second chance she never thought she'd want. This moment marks a powerful shift in Nora's perspective. She no longer mourns the lives she never lived, but instead chooses to embrace the life she has. Her new social media post begins with a profound realization. It is easy to mourn the lives we aren't living. She explains how regret can be dangerous, as people often cling to imagined possibilities without knowing how they would have truly turned out. Instead of dwelling on what could have been, she urges others to focus on making the most of the life they have. She acknowledges that pain and suffering are inevitable, but so is the beauty of living. Joe visits Nora in the hospital, and they both apologize for their past unkindness. Joe shares that he has stopped drinking and started going to the gym, a step toward a healthier life. He also delivers a heartfelt message. Leaving a band and leaving life are not the same thing, and he needs her to stay. Later, Nora receives a text from Izzy, who sends her pictures of humpback whales and tells her she plans to move back to Bedford. She misses Nora. This small but significant message, along with her conversation with Joe, reassures Nora that change is always possible. Sometimes it just takes time. This chapter beautifully encapsulates Nora's newfound appreciation for life. She takes stock of her belongings, not with regret, but with gratitude for the life she almost lost. She is no longer burdened by trying to live for others. She is choosing to live on her own terms. When Doreen calls, asking to restart Leo's lessons, it's a small but significant moment, affirming that Nora still has the power to positively impact others. She plays music on her piano afterward, a quiet act of joy and self-expression. Noticing a National Geographic issue featuring an article on Krakatoa, Nora draws a powerful metaphor. Life, like a volcano, can be destructive, but from destruction comes growth. The hardships she endured shaped her, but they also opened the door to renewal. Visiting Mrs. Elm at Oakleaf Care Home, Nora finds her mentor aged and tired, yet delighted to see her. Mrs. Elm confesses to feeling like her game is over, weighed down by loneliness and regret over how she treated others before coming to the care home. But Nora reminds her of the kindness she once showed, kindness that saved her. In response, Mrs. Elm reassures Nora that she was always special. As the chapter closes, Mrs. Elm imparts a final wisdom: one never knows how the game will end. With this in mind, Nora considers visiting Ash at his marathon, a step toward embracing new possibilities. And with that, we come to the end of the Midnight Library. Before we wrap up, I want to emphasize something important. This novel is purely fictional. In reality, there is no Midnight Library where we can explore alternate lives. Death is final, and the only life we truly have is the one we are living right now. But that's exactly what makes this book so special. It doesn't offer an escape from life's problems. It offers a shift in perspective. Life will always have ups and downs. It will throw challenges at us when we least expect them. But what truly matters is how we perceive those challenges and what we choose to do with the opportunities we have. The Midnight Library reminds us that we often dwell on regrets and wonder about the lives we didn't live, without realizing that the life we are living now has immense potential. It is within our hands to shape it into something meaningful. Nora's journey teaches us that happiness doesn't come from chasing an idea of a perfect life. Instead, it comes from appreciating the life we already have and making the best of it. We may not have control over every circumstance, but we always have control over our perspective. As the novel beautifully illustrates, life is not about erasing pain or avoiding struggles. It's about learning, growing, and finding joy despite them. So if you're going through a rough phase, have patience. Bad days don't last forever. Just as Nora found hope and a renewed sense of purpose, so can we. Life is a journey, and every step we take shapes it into something unique and valuable. With that, we conclude this novel. I hope you enjoyed this deep dive into the Midnight Library. Let me know in the comments which novel you'd like to explore next. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more such videos. See you in the next one.